1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's what the problem was. Good morning. We'll try this again. I'm sure it's working. It was the mixer console, not the software. So, because Friday, when I use for the podcast, I mute these mics in here. So that's what it was. Oh, right. We have some more good classes, some more videos looking at natural selection. Last week we were looking and discussing this idea of how evolution has produced its own paradigm of how we have come into existence. And I think it's important for us to kind of continue that. We're still using the video clips. They're actually segments out of the entire movie, is genesishistory.com. So as we look at this, I want us to keep remembering that we have two paradigms. One paradigm is considered evolution, and the other paradigm, and this is the paradigms, I guess I should start here, the paradigms where we've come from, where life has come from. We have one paradigm that believes that we have evolved in an accidental kind of no design, no purpose behind it. It just happened, and all the elements and chemicals and things were together at the right times, and over billions and billions of years that all these things just started to happen. And these processes, one of them natural selection and the evolution, things that are changing. And that's what evolution means. It's changing, evolving. And so as this evolution is occurring, a natural selection process is happening. This process is choosing things that are the best for that organism. And last week, we noticed that one of the things about mutations is that most mutations that occur do not create anything new. They don't create something new. They affect something that's in existence. That, to me, says a lot. I mean, because that's what natural selection supposedly is saying, is that there is a change or a variation. Well, that change or variation is a mutation, because anything that changes from the original is a mutation. It mutates to something different. And that those mutations have to either be a good one or a bad one. And I like the way that he had pointed out, kind of like a fish looking up on the land and saying, okay, well, I'm going to need eyeballs that can see in air. I'm going to need to have lungs in order to breathe oxygen in, because I'm getting it through water and gills. And then I'm going to need some mobility. So I'm going to need to develop some way of moving myself when I get on top of the land. Now just think about all those systems there, that they're happening random and mutating and changing. And mutation is necessary. It's absolutely necessary in order for the evolutionists to have what they believe in. Because we evolved. And so evolution process is a changing constantly for the better. And that which is weak is eliminated. It dies and it's thrown out. You know, he also brought up the fact is, how does natural selection know what is good from bad? What's a good mutation from a bad one? Well, it need another billion years to figure out. And I know I pointed out kind of the silly thing about a woodpecker, but that first bird that banged his head against a tree to try to get some food out of it, I'm sorry, you mean you're telling me he died? And then he finally, I know that birds do change. Please don't get me wrong. I do know that. There is some. The finches, it's obvious. There is some evolutionary, there are some changes that have evolved to adapt. Polar bears are a grizzly bear that's white. They have evolved. That's a change, not a mutation. It's a change. And mutations, again, don't create something new. So that's the paradigm of evolution. And I know I'm not probably representing them. And if somebody's listening to me that's a firm evolutionist is probably just, cringing that I'm not representing all the aspects of it. But I think that is it in the nutshell. And there's a lot of things then. We look at the paradigm of creationism and creationists. There is a designer behind it, and that is shown and demonstrated in all aspects of the organisms and how they've evolved, all the way to the DNA, the genome, and how that we have a set of information that's included in it, and that how does it pass that information on? And the other part is amino acids and stuff don't have information. It has to have information to make itself. And so what started that? There has to be a starting point, see? That's the whole problem. And I'm not going to say that as a creationist that we can explain everything, because we have an ultimate faith in God, but the evolutionists can't either, and they have a faith in what? Science, which is a moving target. It really is. I don't mean target that way, but I mean, if we go all the way back to when we thought we had a flat earth, all the way back to the time when we thought that, that we were the center of the universe and everything revolves around us, it keeps changing, doesn't it? And so that's what we see with science. But our God does not change. It is consistent, and it's more logical for that. So now we're going to look at, can natural selection bring about new species? See, we come back to that again of new. I want you to look at the way he talks about the variations. And I like him because he's humble enough to admit, yeah, there's still some things that we as Christians, we struggle with, but the logic of it is still there. So we're going to go ahead and watch the video, and then we'll have a little wrap up at the end of it.
We've talked to a number of scientists so far, and it's clear that to believe in the Genesis paradigm as opposed to the conventional paradigm puts you in a minority. And that means that it's probably tough along the way. And so what is it about the Genesis paradigm and the data and the evidence that you see around you that causes you to continue to hold to that in the midst of a whole flow of things trying to pull you another way?
It works, and it keeps working. That's what keeps impressing me. It keeps dragging me back, even when I think, well, maybe I should not bother. I keep finding new ways of understanding things, new insights into nature. I mean, this is what science is supposed to do, right? And for me to read through Genesis and see how integral it is to the basic Christian story of creation, fall, and redemption, I don't think that we can just reimagine all that. And then when I go and think about what kind of scientific insights that I can gain from that, it continues to impress me how much progress we're making. If creationism is so bad and so wrong, why is it we keep making progress? Why do we keep, even the geology and the biology, the whole 9 yards, all of it? It seems like we're continually finding new insights and new ways of understanding things. That suggests that we must be on the right track, I think.
So this is not just a blind faith for you. I mean, this is something that you see substantiated everywhere you look.
No, I don't think it's a blind faith. I'm not even sure that I like that phrase. I mean, it implies that, there's just nothing there. I'm just going to believe for no reason. But I also don't want to underestimate the open questions. There are a lot of hard problems that creationists still have to sort of resolve. But the fact that with so few of us, we keep finding new ways of thinking about this problem and that problem, that's like, I'm on a long journey and I'm not to the city that I want to get to yet, but I keep passing those signs that tell me how many miles I got to go, which is pretty exciting. That tells me I'm on the right track. I'm going the right direction. So that's the way I look at it. I just find it really exciting, even though I might not have all the answers that I'd like to have yet.
Well, that seems to be the kind of the characteristic that we're seeing of the creationist scientists that we're talking to, that there's an underlying confidence there that the scripture is right.
Absolutely, yeah. The more I dig, the more I work at it, the more insight I get, the more answers I get. It's really exciting. It's really exciting. Mm-hmm. I can't imagine why, young science students wouldn't want to do what we do. I mean, it's some of the coolest research that you can possibly imagine.
But But there are still these great questions to be answered, and you're looking at the zebras, and they're all unique, and yet all of these creatures are just so much complexity and diversity. How does the standard story, the conventional paradigm, explain all of that?
Well, they would use evolution, right? So millions of years, random variations, all things that are alive now, that cactus, that zebra, the grass here, it's all related. We all go back to a common ancestor that lived billions of years ago. And through the process of mutation and genetic variation and natural selection, that's where we get the stuff that we have today.
But doesn't that imply that all of those mutations are positive? They're all moving towards all of this diversity that we have?
Well, there certainly has to be a lot of beneficial mutations. There can be bad stuff. I mean, that's what natural selection is going to get rid of, because natural selection is basically killing off the stuff that's not fit to survive. So anything bad that crops up is going to be presumably eliminated by natural selection. So there can be bad mutations in the conventional model. But yeah, you got to have good mutations too to make the variety of things that we see. You've got to have a lot of really good stuff that happens in the history of mutation.
Does that seem reasonable?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, from what we can see in genomes today, we can see, yeah, I mean, there's some mutations that might be helpful in some circumstances. Other mutations are probably not so good. But the vast majority of them, they don't do anything. They're just useless. And so, you know, we all have to think about mutations because we have, when we can look inside of a created kind, we can see differences in genetics. So, you know, creationists need mutations too. The real question is, you know, what kinds of mutations are happening? So in my view, it's not a random mutation. Just randomly changing any part of the genome is probably not going to do much of anything, really. What we need are mutations that are helpful and beneficial, but those are the kinds of things that can only be built into the system. Evolution needs mutations that produce an external feature that can be selected, right? That can alter the survivability of the organism. And sometimes that happens, sometimes it doesn't. The vast majority of times, there isn't going to be any external feature that you can select for.
So we're kind of talking about how random mutations can produce such exquisite design.
Yeah, in some sense it is. It's not just mutation, because you got selection going on there too. So you do have features that are clearly well designed for the environment. So right over here we've got these oryxes, right? Beautiful, beautiful creatures, and very, very pale colors. The wild range of the oryx is right on the southern end of the Sahara Desert. And so you can see, yeah, their coloration makes sense. Natural selection, if you get a really dark colored one, that's going to be really easy for predators to find. And so they end up being these really beautiful light colors. And that's an example of where selection would take a variation and turn it into an adaptation.
And that brings us back to the notion that a really exquisite design in the beginning
I think so. Oh, absolutely.
Has provided these creatures with the ability to survive and to change for their benefit.
Absolutely. So the ability to be able to change your coloration like that, to be able to fit an environment, that's got to be built into the system before it starts. As I said, random mutations, they generally don't do anything. So it's hard to imagine how you're going to get a lot of random mutations that are going to actually produce just the right coloration for the environment that you're living in.
What about the issue of natural selection, though? Does that have the power to get us to where we are?
That's a hot area of research, lots of people looking into that. And what we find most often with natural selection is that natural selection does a lot of fine-tuning. Natural selection is basically all about killing off things that aren't fit for the environment. So if you're a finch in the Galapagos and you have a really tiny beak and the only food available to you is really big hard seeds, you're going to die. And that's exactly what we observe. And so we can watch over the generations as the beak size of finches change in the Galapagos. But they're still finches, they're still birds. The notion that natural selection can generate all of the diversity we see, that's not been demonstrated.
But that natural selection, is that working within the kinds, or does that allow us to go beyond that?
from my perspective, most of the examples of natural selection are working within the created kinds, right? And so, now don't get me wrong, I mean, natural selection and random variation can do amazing things. I mean, it's pretty astonishing the kinds of changes that we can see. But no, they don't change from one kind to another. We have not observed that. All we've observed are the kinds of changes within populations that happen. Not even, across species, mostly within populations. So it's very small stuff, and that's why I call it fine-tuning, because it's mostly taking one group of critters and making sure that they're really fit exactly for the environment where they're living.
Natural selection, then, obviously exists. We see it around us. We see it in the fossil record. Have you pondered and thought about what God was doing when He created all of this that gave the potential for natural selection to occur?
Natural selection is sort of an inevitable part of the world. If you have random variation and things can die, then there's going to be natural selection. So before the fall, I would say there's probably no natural selection going on in the animal world, at least. But then after the fall, it serves as that fine-tuning feature, right? So it makes sure that the population of animals still survives, even though the environment's fluctuating and changing. It's just an inevitable kind of thing that you have to have in a world that is changing all the time. And, the flood is coming. God knows this at creation. So, yeah, there's this system in place already, not just to allow variations to come out of animals, but for even the most careful adjustments to make sure that populations don't just crash and die, go extinct.
So the tree of life that we see in the textbooks, that is a picture that everything started from one thing, and all of this diversity and exquisite beauty that we see came from that one trunk, so to speak.
So you're right. I mean, evolution would say there is only one tree, and it all goes back to a single common ancestor, which is, the base of the tree. But I would say, no, there's actually multiple trees. There's a felid tree, which has all the cats on it. There's the canid tree, which has all the dogs on it. There's the ursid tree, which has all the bears on it. There's the equid tree with all the horses on it, and so on and so forth. Each individual created kind, then, has its own individual tree, so that what you end up with is not one big tree of life. You end up with something like an orchard or a forest, where you have lots of different trees all growing together from the same created base.
But this forest has trees that have a lot of branches on it, and that's that each kind now branching out into all of these different species that we see.
Yeah, absolutely. So, they all start at creation, right? So they have that common beginning, but they're individual trees, so they're not all related to a common ancestor. They're all related to their own individual common ancestor, so the cat ancestor and the horse ancestor and whatnot. And so then they diversify when you have this period of massive upheaval when critters can change all over the place.
And is that what the data shows us?
I think so. I would start with what I read in Genesis, which tells me about, at the end of creation week, you have all these different creatures already there. You have flying things and swimming things and creeping things. And when I look at the data of nature, I see both similarity and difference. So an evolutionary biologist would say, look at all the similarity, and that puts everything on a common evolutionary tree. And I would say, yes, there is similarity, but there are also significant differences. And the significant differences, and this is really important, they end up exactly where I would expect them to. So I look at the Bible and I see flying things, swimming things, that sort of thing. Those are really big categories. I don't see it mentioning individual species. You read through Genesis 1 and 2, you won't see lions and tigers and things like that. So it's got to be somewhere between, bird and the individual species of bird. That's where I would expect to find these differences. That's where I find them, over and over and over again. It's astonishing. And so, I shouldn't be astonished, but I am. It always delights me when I think, hey, the Bible works. What do you know? But that's exactly how it works in this situation. I find these differences that essentially make sense of exactly what I'm seeing in the scripture. I'm seeing those differences right there where they should be.
As a scientist, looking at all of this data and everything that you see, it seems what you're saying is that the Genesis paradigm answers all of this data better.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, ultimately, I think it does, because it embraces both similarity and difference. Now, as we've already said, there's lots of questions that are still out there. But I'm pretty confident, given what our paradigm can explain, I'm very confident that those answers are going to be found.
But in this single tree of life, in the conventional paradigm, if that were true, then we must have all of these transitional forms between kinds.
Yeah, so that's a good question. So there are a lot of critters out there, especially in the fossil record, that are put forward as these things they call transitional forms. I like to call them intermediates. I like to just think of them in terms of the qualities that they possess rather than whether there's some sort of transition. And in my view, based on my years of study, I see two kinds of intermediates. I see intermediates that occur within a created kind, where I can say, oh yeah, this is this created kind. And then I see intermediates that appear to possess traits of more than one created kind. So actually I have right here in my backpack one of those sorts of transitions. So this is a mesohippus. Okay?
You have to explain that.
Very small, right?
Mm-hmm.
But this is a member of the horse kind. And if you've ever seen a horse without its skin on, you'd say, oh yeah, that looks just like a horse. But that's not enough for a scientist. You can't just go on, oh, it looks like a horse. You got to do some statistical analysis. And I've done that too. So I've used characteristics of the skull and the teeth here to show that, in fact, yes, this is a horse. It fits in the horse-created kind. It is not something else. It is definitely a horse. So this thing is supposed to be one of those transitional fossils as horses are evolving from their tiny little ancestors. And what I'm seeing here is really just another version of a single created kind. Yes, it's a horse, and yes, it's different from the horses that we have today, but the transition is only within the created kind. Now there are others, as I said. There are intermediates that appear to possess traits of more than one created kind, but we'll have to go over to the birdhouse to check those out.
Okay.
Well, hello. So any thoughts, comments? I think we just seem to, there's a part, it feels like we just, the same thing, just kind of, there's like a common theme that just keeps coming out, that this type of idea that these are accidents, that the changes are something that, accidentally happened for the betterment of the species or organism, which, to me just keeps blowing my mind that, you're looking at things in which you're trying to explain because you don't believe in God. And that's really the fundamental point. I believe in science, and I believe a lot of the evidences, even though, I may not understand exactly maybe how it fits into God's plan, doesn't mean I reject it. I still look at it, but I still have a foundation that I believe in God. I don't know how gravity and the theory of relativity fits in with God. Most of us, humans didn't even understand, what a black hole was or even knew that it existed until this very recent century. There's many things we as humans lack the knowledge to know, and when we try to pit ourselves and our knowledge against a God, a designer of such power and wisdom, we look like the fool. And that's what I feel people who are just outrightly rejecting the concept of at least saying there is a designer. And this idea that when you talk about who has better faith in what the paradigms, again, the paradigm of you believe in the whole process of evolving from nothing, or you believe that there's a designer who has brought everything into life, into existence. I really do think it takes a lot more faith for an atheist to believe in that it was all accidental and that it took billions and billions and billions of years to get to the status that we're at. And the science that shows that it wasn't billions of years We've looked at the geology of the world. We've looked at the layers. We've looked at so many things in the fossil records, and just even, for just real quick, looking at Mount St. Helen. Mount St. Helen, that was a huge geological breakthrough for geologists, because when that happened, it created layers very similar to what they found in the Grand Canyon. And it wasn't created over millions of years. It was created over weeks, months, same exact layers. And so, there's just those types of things that here you have something new that's come up, like all the geological facts of what we've learned from something like Mount St. Helens, because we could observe it. Nobody was around when the Grand Canyon was created. We say, well, of course not. We didn't live a billion years. But you can't prove it. But when you have something like Mount St. Helens, where you can look at it and go, that happened rapidly, why do you keep fighting it? Why do but because you're afraid of God. I really believe it. People are afraid that there's a God. And the only conclusion I can come to that is you're afraid of being accountable. Because if there's somebody more powerful than you, then that means we're accountable to them. That they're going to say, hey, what's going on? This is my domain, this is my world. And that means then the rest of what the Bible says is true. And people don't want that. They want to live by themselves. They want to be what I call little g gods. And that's the whole battle that has been from the beginning of time as well. That's documented where? In the Bible. It starts in the Garden of Eden with that one fruit tree that was there. And God said, eat or don't eat. And the little G and Eve and Adam, wanting to be like God, right? What'd they do? They ate. Because why? The temptation was put before them that, one, you're not going to die, and two, you're going to become like him, the God himself. Oh, wow. I want that knowledge of good and evil? Really? How's that worked out for us? So, I'm not shocked that people are developing evolution. They need it. But they also need to accept that you're also rejecting some very strong facts that show and point toward a designer. Everything from the earth showing it, to the balance and everything about the universe, everything from when we look at the biology, we look at the DNA, the Genome Project that has proven time and time again the amazing information that's in DNA. That's an accident, So I pray for you, if you're an evolutionist, to at least think. To me, evolutionists are those who believe in science. Okay, good, and I'm glad. Then believe in all of it. Consider it. That's what being scientific is about, is to consider everything. And if that happens to include something you're uncomfortable with, you should consider it, right? That's the scientific process, that when a scientist puts something together and he puts a hypothesis together and then he goes to test it, he knows it may not come up and support what he has tried to conclude, whether he likes it or not. And he has to try to repeat it. And if it still doesn't support it, then what does he do? He has to modify his thought, his hypothesis, and then he retests it. And again, you can't change the outcome to support your hypothesis. You have to let the outcome and the results then modify your hypothesis. And that's the problem with evolution, is you've got this theory they call of evolution, but the data and the testing of it keeps changing, but they won't change the evolutionary theory. Does that sound scientific? It doesn't to me. And I think that, like he explained, there is natural selection happening within species, within kinds. And we can look at it from, if you had all colored bears in snow, eventually those bears that could hide are going to survive and reproduce more of their type of bear and color. Example, the polar bear. The grizzly, the brown bears, the black bears, and all of them in the Arctic, probably not going to survive. And so eventually, what will you have left? You have nothing but the white bear. So it's the same across. And that's another brilliant thing I really loved about what he brought out, was this idea of how that the environment prior to the flood was stable. And there was no need necessary for any type of changing or adapting to the environment. No natural selection, because it was balanced. There was no change. But after the flood, there was this balancing out again. The environment, different locations, the world divided out. You have colder, hotter climates, and everything as the continents divide, move around the planet. The climate changing, and adaptation, vegetation, different types of food sources changing. That God, knowing that from the beginning, allowed the information within and the processes of all biological forms to be able to adapt, to survive. And so that's why we find different animals such as the polar bear or animals in Africa that have adapted to be able to survive in that environment. And those that didn't, well, natural selection did take them out. So, well, I think that's it for the class. If there's any closing thoughts or comments, again, I want you to look at isgenesishistory.com. Tons of good information, support them. I think that it's something that you can use as a resource. After class last week, we had somebody visiting. He came up to me, or after worship, he came back in the afternoon and told me that he sent that to his daughter, because his daughter's at a university where she's being barraged with evolution. And this was something he said is perfect for her. So, and that's what I want. I want you to use this as a tool for yourself to be encouraged, even though you don't remember everything that all these guys are saying. But you know where you can go, and you can share this for people who are also struggling with it, because every aspect and it seems like everything around us is just permeated this idea of evolution. And we just say it like it's natural. We just say it like it's so accepted. Well, yeah, that dinosaur was 10 billion years ago. It's just becomes so common that I'm very frightened that Christians as well are starting to just let that soak in. And you shouldn't. You need to stay fast to your truth and to your faith, and that's in God and what the Bible has spoken. Okay. Well, we'll see you guys hopefully at 10:30, 10:45 for worship, and then 4 o'clock for worship, and then Wednesday I will not be here. So no class Wednesday night, and we'll see you then. And no podcast either this coming week. I'm glad I remembered to say that. So we'll see you guys the next week or next Sunday morning at 9:30 for Bible study.